Back when I was a teenager in the 1980s, the nearest thing that I ever got to browsing the internet was picking up these store catalogues whenever I went into town, and then once I got home I'd look through them very carefully, picking out the things that I'd buy if I had enough money. Now, one thing every teenage boy wanted in the 1980s was a big old portable stereo or a boombox. In your mind, it's a thing that you thought would transform you from being whack to being fresh. If you had a gigantic one with loads of buttons and dials on it, then you were surely going to be the coolest kid around. And two of the machines that would sit pretty near the top of any teenager's shopping list would be the JVC M90, as favoured by LL Cool J and the Beastie Boys, or the Sharp GF777. Now, if you want to pick either of those two machines up nowadays in good condition, make sure you've got quite a lot of room on your credit card, because they command very high prices. However, it wasn't that much different back in the day. Your pocket money or part-time job or whatever wouldn't cover the cost of one of these decent stereos, so instead you had to compromise and get something a little bit lower down the range. Of course, you look for certain features on them, like a twin tape graphic equalizer, flashing VU meters, as loud as possible and as large as possible as well, and you'd end up getting something much like this. Now, it might not look like much, but believe it or not, this is a brand new device. But in reality, I think it's been found inside a container or something. There's a company on eBay, anyway, selling a load of these, and they reckon they're from 1986, and they were supposed to be sold in Dixons in the UK. Now, whilst the portable stereos that we saw at the beginning of the video were the kind of thing that a teenager would have really wanted to own, this is more like the kind of thing that your average teenager actually did end up owning, and it's a pretty poor device. We'll look at it in a bit more detail in a moment, but just looking around it, you can see it's trying to pretend it's better than it is. It's got logos plastered all over it. It's got text that explain things that don't need explaining. For example, a cassette will say like auto stop, like that's some massive big deal, and there's little stickers on things that seem to be covering other things over. There's a logo disaster stereo sound, it says. Well, you can see that it's got two speakers, high speed dubbing, and what's this continuous play button that doesn't seem to do an awful lot? Another thing from the time were speakers with information behind them, logos that say like dynamic speaker, which means nothing. Seems to have a three-way speaker there as well, so we'll look at that in more detail. Around the back here, we've got a couple of connectors. On the right are the speaker connectors. I haven't put those on yet. And on the left, we've got a phono input, which is for your turntable. You can see at the bottom there, it takes 10 UM1 batteries, which would make it quite heavy, I'd imagine. Anyway, you plug in the speakers in here. Of course, those speakers can be detached and moved slightly away from the device, so you can use it in your house. The power lead it comes with is a Euro one, which makes me think this wasn't actually supposed to go on sale in the UK. Anyway, powering it on definitely seems to be working, so wherever it's been stored in that nasty box all that time has not done it any harm at all. So let's try playing a cassette on it. Now, who remembers the dad test to find out how good a cassette deck is? Yep, that's right. You press eject, and the slower the door opens, the better the cassette deck is. So they wouldn't be impressed with this one. That one definitely seems a little bit too keen to open. Very nasty plasticky doors on these as well, which are quite difficult to get the cassette into. And that one doesn't even seem to close properly. It turned out the problem was this little connector here had become detached from the door, and that was the thing that operates the soft eject. So as you see now, it works fine. Both decks will pass the dad test. But before we listen to a cassette, just have a listen to the machine with nothing playing for a second. That is a heck of a lot of hiss. One of the speakers seems to buzz more than the other has more hiss, but together they sound dreadful. Anyway, let's have a listen to a cassette. It sounds absolutely terrible, and I don't know how much of this to attribute to the age of the thing, but I've got a good feeling it probably sounded just as bad the day it came out of the factory. The graphic equalizer will give you a choice of it either sounding dreadful or terrible. And the volume, as you can see, doesn't go very loud and it just contains an awful lot of hiss. Now this machine perfectly illustrates the point I was trying to make a couple of months ago when I did a video about cassettes. I called that video Cassettes Better Than You Don't Remember. The reason I say you don't remember is because if you were like me, you weren't playing them back on high-end equipment back then. No, you were probably buying the cheapest tapes that you could find, recording off the radio and playing them back on awful pieces of equipment like this. So to form an opinion on cassette based on only ever having used the worst possible tape in a terrible machine is, to use a rather strained car analogy, like saying that all vehicles are terrible when the only car you've ever been in is one of these. I think the best thing that we can do with this machine is to take it apart, but before we do that I just want to show you one other weird thing that I've noticed. If you try and play both decks at the same time, this happens. There really should be a mechanism in there that stops that from happening. And then I had a thought about this digital clock. I realised the reason that that's on there up near the radio tuner is to fool people into thinking you've got a digital tuner on this device, again trying to look better than it actually is. And what's that button about? We're going to find out about that. We're going to have to take the back off this and see exactly what's going on in here. So I've removed the back and here's what's inside. Now I'm no electronics expert, but that does look a little bit messy to me. Let's try and figure out what year this thing was made. Usually there's a sticker on the motors that tells you when they were put together. And looking at this, if I'm not mistaken, I'd say that was 1990. You know, 12th of February 1990 or 2nd of December 90, one or the other. But it's definitely 1990. No mention of 1986 in here, which is when it was supposed to be made. Horrible, cheap cassette mechanisms down at the bottom. And this bit on the front, I'll just take that off there. And look, it's just covering up some sort of holes in the thing. Presumably there was different models in the range, and higher up the range there'd be something exciting behind there, or maybe it was just something that held it during manufacture. As far as that continuous play button goes, well, it's just linked up to that inside, and we'll unscrew it and see exactly what that does. Absolutely nothing. It's just a fake button that they've shoved in there. Again, presumably on a higher up the range model there'd be a real button there that did something. And then when you press record, look at this here, there's this big black plastic piece which moves up the inside of the machine all the way up and pushes something on the circuit board up there and then pops out the top. It's got a little bit of a spring loaded mechanism, and all it's doing is pushing that little button there. What a weird mechanism, all the way up inside the machine. Now let's have a look at those speakers. Remember, they're supposed to be 200 watts PMPO. What's PMPO, you might ask? It means absolutely nothing. It's just a marketing term. It doesn't really reflect anything at all. It's a little bit like saying that the maximum speed of this car is 100 miles per hour, if you throw it off a cliff. So let's get inside these speakers and see exactly what power output they're capable of. So the first thing you notice when you pull them apart, the wire's held in there with a knot tied in it. So that's a bit of professional work for you. Now the main speaker, 4 ohm, 8 watt. And that is wired into a tweeter here, and that is 4 ohm and 5 watts. So we're up to 13 watts per speaker. Plus we've got this little bit up here, so I'll take out those screws and we'll remove the part from the front and see exactly what that is, because it's just wired into the other speaker. Now you can see I've had to cut the wires on this to get everything out, but pulling that out of there, you can see it's got a little bit of a silver dome on there, and removing that just shows it as a piezo sounder, the kind of thing that you would get in the back of, say, a wristwatch or one of those musical birthday cards that played your horrible rendition of Happy Birthday. According to the instructions, they call that a super tweeter. Now, I'm completely unfamiliar with the makeup of speakers. Perhaps putting a piezo sounder in one is a normal thing, but I was a little bit surprised to see it. As far as the output goes, the instructions say it's 20 watts, which is 10 watts plus 10 watts. Well, I got 26 watts from my 13 plus 13, but really, it's all academic because the thing sounds terrible, however loud it is. It really doesn't matter. This is a god-awful piece of equipment, but completely representative of the kind of thing that people had back in the day, unfortunately. So if you're perhaps a set decorator and you want something to properly reflect a teenager's bedroom from 1990, well, there's links to purchase one of these in the video description. But that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.